Night had fallen over the mighty city of Babylon. From miles away, travelers could see its towering walls glowing under hundreds of torches. The city was the pride of the ancient world. Massive gates of bronze guarded its entrances. Hanging gardens rose like green mountains above the palace terraces. Wide streets stretched through the city like rivers of stone. Babylon looked invincible. Inside the royal palace, however, something very different was happening. The palace of King Belshazzar was alive with celebration. Thousands of oil lamps burned along the marble walls, casting golden light across polished floors. Servants hurried back and forth carrying trays of roasted meats, sweet fruits, and overflowing cups of wine. Music filled the air. Trumpets sounded. Drums echoed through the enormous banquet hall. Belshazzar had ordered a great feast, one of the largest Babylon had ever seen. 1,000 nobles were invited. Princes, governors, generals, wealthy merchants, and high officials gathered beneath the towering pillars of the palace hall. They laughed loudly, drank deeply, and praised the glory of Babylon. Outside the palace walls, however, danger was approaching. The armies of the Medo-Persian Empire were already moving across the land. Their soldiers had been marching for months, slowly tightening their grip around the great empire of Babylon. But inside the palace, no one seemed worried. Why should they be? Babylon's walls were enormous, so thick that chariots could ride side by side along the top. Its gates were iron. Its towers were unbreakable, and the Euphrates River flowed directly through the city, providing endless water. Babylon had everything it needed to survive a siege for years. So the king celebrated. Belshazzar sat on a magnificent throne at the head of the hall. His crown shimmered in the firelight, and heavy rings glittered on his fingers as he lifted a golden cup filled with wine. Around him, the nobles cheered. "Long live the king," someone shouted. Belshazzar smiled, clearly pleased with himself. Wine flowed freely. Laughter grew louder. Soon the music grew wild and reckless. Then, in the middle of the celebration, Belshazzar made a decision. A dangerous one. Drunk with pride and surrounded by cheering nobles, the king suddenly raised his hand for silence. "Bring the gold vessels," he commanded. The hall quieted slightly. Servants looked at one another. They knew exactly what the king meant. Years earlier, Belshazzar's grandfather, Nebuchadnezzar, had conquered the holy city of Jerusalem. During that conquest, sacred treasures had been taken from the temple of the God of Israel. Golden cups, sacred bowls, holy vessels used only in worship. For years, those items had been kept safely in Babylon's royal treasury. They were not meant for ordinary use. But Belshazzar did not care. Tonight, he wanted to show his power. He wanted to prove that Babylon ruled over every nation and every god. So the servants obeyed. They brought out the golden vessels from the temple in Jerusalem. The room filled with murmurs as the sacred objects were placed on the tables. Belshazzar lifted one of the cups and laughed. "To the gods of Babylon," he shouted. The nobles roared with approval. They drank from the holy cups while praising their idols, gods of gold, silver, bronze, iron, wood, and stone. The celebration grew louder, more reckless, more arrogant. But something unseen had already begun to move. As the laughter echoed through the hall, the torches on the walls flickered strangely. A sudden chill passed through the room. Some of the guests glanced around nervously. Then it happened. Without warning, something appeared on the wall. Not a shadow, not a reflection. A hand, a human hand, floating in the air. There was no arm, no body, just the hand. And slowly, deliberately, the fingers began to move. The hand started writing on the plaster wall of the king's palace. Every eye in the room froze. The music stopped. Wine cups fell from trembling fingers. The scratching sound of the writing echoed through the silent hall. Glowing letters formed across the wall. Strange words. Ancient words. Words no one understood. King Belshazzar stared at the hand in horror. The color drained from his face. His confident smile vanished. His hands began to shake so violently that the golden cup slipped from his fingers and crashed onto the floor. The mighty king of Babylon, ruler of the greatest empire on earth, was suddenly terrified. The Bible says his knees knocked together. No one spoke. No one moved. Thousands of eyes stared at the wall. The glowing message hung there in the torchlight. A message from somewhere beyond human power. A warning written not by man, but by heaven. That night, Babylon received a message. and before the sun rose again, an empire would fall. Long before the mysterious hand appeared on the palace wall, the empire of Babylon stood as the greatest power the world had ever seen. To travelers approaching the city, Babylon looked less like a city and more like a fortress built by giants. Massive double walls stretched for miles across the plains. The outer wall was so thick that chariots could race along the top. Guard towers rose high into the sky, watching the horizon in every direction. At the heart of this magnificent city stood the royal palace, home of King Belshazzar. But Babylon had not always belonged to him. Years earlier, the empire had been ruled by a far more famous king, Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar had been a brilliant conqueror and builder. Under his leadership, Babylon expanded its power across the ancient world. He conquered nations. He destroyed armies. He even captured the holy city of Jerusalem, carrying away its treasures and its people. But Nebuchadnezzar's story had been more than a story of conquest. It had been a story of pride and a humbling lesson from God. At the height of his power, Nebuchadnezzar had once believed that Babylon existed because of his own greatness. He had looked over the city he built and proudly declared that it was the work of his own strength. But that pride had cost him dearly. According to the records remembered throughout the empire, Nebuchadnezzar had once lost his mind for a time. He had lived like an animal in the fields until he finally recognized that heaven, not human kings, rules over the kingdoms of the earth. After that humbling experience, Nebuchadnezzar had acknowledged the power of the God of Israel. But that lesson did not last long in Babylon. Years passed, kings changed, and eventually the throne was inherited by Belshazzar. Unlike his grandfather, Belshazzar had little interest in humility. He had grown up surrounded by luxury and power. From childhood, he had known only royal privilege. Servants obeyed his every command. Soldiers protected him day and night. Wealth flowed through the palace like water through the Euphrates River. To Belshazzar, Babylon seemed eternal. Its walls were unbreakable. Its armies were powerful. Its treasures were endless. And its gods, at least in Belshazzar's mind, were stronger than any other. Yet the truth was far different. Far beyond Babylon's mighty walls, a new power was rising. The empire of the Medo-Persian Empire had begun expanding across the lands of the East. Their armies were disciplined and relentless. City after city had fallen before them. But inside Babylon, few people worried. Why should they? Babylon was considered the most secure city on earth. The Euphrates River flowed directly through its center, providing unlimited water. Massive storehouses held enough grain to feed the population for years. Even if an enemy surrounded the city, Babylon could survive indefinitely. Belshazzar believed this with absolute confidence. And confidence slowly turned into arrogance. Rather than preparing his kingdom for danger, Belshazzar filled his days with luxury. Lavish celebrations became common in the palace. Nights were spent in music, dancing, and endless feasts. The king surrounded himself with nobles who praised him constantly. They told him Babylon would last forever. They told him no army could defeat them. They told him the gods of Babylon protected the empire. Belshazzar believed every word. But there was one person in the kingdom who remembered a very different story. An old man who had served in Babylon for many decades. A man known for wisdom beyond human understanding. A man who had once stood before Nebuchadnezzar himself. That man was Daniel. Daniel had been taken from Jerusalem as a young man during the Babylonian conquest. Over the years, he had risen to positions of great responsibility within the empire. Kings had consulted him when dreams troubled their sleep or mysteries baffled their advisors. Daniel had seen Babylon at its strongest. He had seen its greatest king humbled. And he knew something Belshazzar had forgotten. Empires rise. Empires fall. And above every throne on earth stands a greater authority. But Belshazzar rarely listened to men like Daniel anymore. The king preferred the company of flatterers, men who celebrated his power instead of questioning it. And so Babylon continued its life of luxury while danger slowly approached. Beyond the walls, the armies of the Medes and Persians moved closer. Their commanders studied the city. They observed the rivers. They waited patiently. Inside the palace, however, Belshazzar prepared for yet another night of celebration. Torches were lit throughout the enormous banquet hall. Tables were covered with fine cloth and overflowing plates of food. Hundreds of servants rushed to prepare the feast. Wine casks were rolled into the hall. Musicians tuned their instruments. Messengers rode through the city inviting nobles and officials to attend. The king planned a celebration unlike any other. A feast for 1,000 lords. Music, wine, laughter, and a display of Babylon's wealth and power. To Belshazzar, the feast was proof that Babylon had nothing to fear. But the truth was already unfolding beyond the city walls. The armies of the Medes and Persians were closer than anyone realized. And before the night ended, Babylon would receive a message it could not ignore. A message not delivered by soldiers, not written by kings, but written by a hand that did not belong to any man on earth. The message that would change everything. Long before the mysterious hand appeared on the palace wall, the empire of Babylon stood as the greatest power the world had ever seen. To travelers approaching the city, Babylon looked less like a city and more like a fortress built by giants. Massive double walls stretched for miles across the plains. The outer wall was so thick that chariots could race along the top. Guard towers rose high into the sky, watching the horizon in every direction. At the heart of this magnificent city stood the royal palace, home of King Belshazzar. But Babylon had not always belonged to him. Years earlier, the empire had been ruled by a far more famous king, Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar had been a brilliant conqueror and builder. Under his leadership, Babylon expanded its power across the ancient world. He conquered nations. He destroyed armies. He even captured the holy city of Jerusalem, carrying away its treasures and its people. But Nebuchadnezzar's story had been more than a story of conquest. It had been a story of pride and a humbling lesson from God. At the height of his power, Nebuchadnezzar had once believed that Babylon existed because of his own greatness. He had looked over the city he built and proudly declared that it was the work of his own strength. But that pride had cost him dearly. According to the records remembered throughout the empire, Nebuchadnezzar had once lost his mind for a time. He had lived like an animal in the fields until he finally recognized that heaven, not human kings, rules over the kingdoms of the earth. After that humbling experience, Nebuchadnezzar had acknowledged the power of the God of Israel. But that lesson did not last long in Babylon. Years passed, kings changed, and eventually the throne was inherited by Belshazzar. Unlike his grandfather, Belshazzar had little interest in humility. He had grown up surrounded by luxury and power. From childhood, he had known only royal privilege. Servants obeyed his every command. Soldiers protected him day and night. Wealth flowed through the palace like water through the Euphrates River. To Belshazzar, Babylon seemed eternal. Its walls were unbreakable. Its armies were powerful. Its treasures were endless. And its gods, at least in Belshazzar's mind, were stronger than any other. Yet the truth was far different. Far beyond Babylon's mighty walls, a new power was rising. The empire of the Medo-Persian Empire had begun expanding across the lands of the East. Their armies were disciplined and relentless. City after city had fallen before them. But inside Babylon, few people worried. Why should they? Babylon was considered the most secure city on earth. The Euphrates River flowed directly through its center, providing unlimited water. Massive storehouses held enough grain to feed the population for years. Even if an enemy surrounded the city, Babylon could survive indefinitely. Belshazzar believed this with absolute confidence. And confidence slowly turned into arrogance. Rather than preparing his kingdom for danger, Belshazzar filled his days with luxury. Lavish celebrations became common in the palace. Nights were spent in music, dancing, and endless feasts. The king surrounded himself with nobles who praised him constantly. They told him Babylon would last forever. They told him no army could defeat them. They told him the gods of Babylon protected the empire. Belshazzar believed every word. But there was one person in the kingdom who remembered a very different story. An old man who had served in Babylon for many decades. A man known for wisdom beyond human understanding. A man who had once stood before Nebuchadnezzar himself. That man was Daniel. Daniel had been taken from Jerusalem as a young man during the Babylonian conquest. Over the years, he had risen to positions of great responsibility within the empire. Kings had consulted him when dreams troubled their sleep or mysteries baffled their advisors. Daniel had seen Babylon at its strongest. He had seen its greatest king humbled. And he knew something Belshazzar had forgotten. Empires rise. Empires fall. and above every throne on earth stands a greater authority. But Belshazzar rarely listened to men like Daniel anymore. The king preferred the company of flatterers, men who celebrated his power instead of questioning it. And so Babylon continued its life of luxury while danger slowly approached. Beyond the walls, the armies of the Medes and Persians moved closer. Their commanders studied the city. They observed the rivers. They waited patiently. Inside the palace, however, Belshazzar prepared for yet another night of celebration. Torches were lit throughout the enormous banquet hall. Tables were covered with fine cloth and overflowing plates of food. Hundreds of servants rushed to prepare the feast. Wine casks were rolled into the hall. Musicians tuned their instruments. Messengers rode through the city inviting nobles and officials to attend. The king planned a celebration unlike any other. A feast for 1,000 lords. Music, wine, laughter, and a display of Babylon's wealth and power. To Belshazzar, the feast was proof that Babylon had nothing to fear. But the truth was already unfolding beyond the city walls. The armies of the Medes and Persians were closer than anyone realized. And before the night ended, Babylon would receive a message it could not ignore. A message not delivered by soldiers, not written by kings, but written by a hand that did not belong to any man on earth. The message that would change everything. The night of the great feast arrived with all the splendor and arrogance that defined the kingdom of Babylon. From every corner of the city, nobles and officials made their way toward the royal palace of King Belshazzar. The palace stood like a mountain of marble and stone, its terraces illuminated by thousands of torches that flickered against the night sky. Servants lined the entrance halls, bowing as the guests arrived. Silk robes brushed across polished floors. Golden jewelry glittered under the firelight. Inside the great banquet hall, long tables stretched across the enormous chamber. They were covered with platters of roasted lamb, spiced vegetables, fresh bread, figs, grapes, and dates from distant lands. Huge jars of wine stood beside silver cups, ready to be poured again and again throughout the night. At the center of the hall stood the king's elevated throne platform. When Belshazzar finally entered the room, the entire hall erupted into cheers. Long live the king! Belshazzar raised his hands proudly as he walked toward his throne. His royal cloak flowed behind him, and his crown sparkled under the torchlight. He looked around at the thousands gathered in his honor and smiled with satisfaction. This was the kind of night he loved. Music began to play. Harps and flutes filled the air with lively melodies. Drums beat steadily, echoing through the tall pillars of the hall. Servants moved constantly between the tables, refilling cups with wine. The celebration quickly grew louder. Laughter rang out across the room. Some nobles stood on their chairs, lifting their cups high into the air as they toasted the greatness of Babylon. Others shouted praises to their gods, the gods they believed had given them victory and power. They praised the gods of gold, the gods of silver, the gods of bronze, the gods of wood and stone. To them, Babylon was blessed by many gods, and those gods had made the empire unstoppable. Belshazzar sat at the head of the hall, drinking deeply from his cup as the celebration grew more reckless. The more wine he drank, the bolder he became. And with every passing moment, the king's pride grew stronger. At last, as the feast reached its loudest and wildest point, Belshazzar suddenly raised his hand. The musicians stopped. The hall slowly quieted. The king stood from his throne and looked across the thousands gathered before him. A mischievous smile appeared on his face. "I have something special for tonight," he announced. The nobles leaned forward with curiosity. Belshazzar turned toward his servants. "Bring the vessels," he ordered. The servants hesitated for a moment. They understood exactly what the king meant. Years earlier, when Nebuchadnezzar had captured the city of Jerusalem, many sacred treasures had been taken from the temple of the God of Israel. Among those treasures were golden cups, bowls, and vessels used only for worship inside the temple. They were sacred items, objects meant to honor the God worshipped by the people of Israel. For years those treasures had been kept in Babylon's royal treasury. They were not used. They were not displayed. But tonight Belshazzar had a different idea. "Bring the golden vessels from the temple," the king repeated, his voice louder this time. A murmur spread through the room. The servants bowed nervously and hurried away. A few moments later they returned carrying trays covered with shining golden objects. The entire hall grew quiet as the sacred vessels were placed on the banquet tables. Some of the older nobles shifted uneasily. Even in Babylon, many people knew the strange stories surrounding the God of Israel. They remembered what had happened to Nebuchadnezzar. But Belshazzar ignored those whispers. He grabbed one of the golden cups and held it high above his head. "This cup once belonged to the God of Jerusalem," he shouted, laughing. The nobles around him laughed as well. "To the gods of Babylon," Belshazzar cried. The crowd roared with approval. Servants filled the sacred cups with wine. The nobles began drinking from them, mocking the God of Israel while praising their own idols. They toasted their gods of gold, their gods of silver, their gods of bronze and stone. The sacred vessels were passed from hand to hand across the tables. Wine spilled across the floors as the celebration grew louder and more reckless. The feast had turned into an act of open mockery. But while the nobles laughed and drank, something unseen was watching. The God they mocked had not been defeated when Jerusalem fell. He had not been weakened when the temple was destroyed. And he had not forgotten the arrogance of Babylon's king. The music played on. The laughter continued. But somewhere beyond the visible world, judgment had already begun. Inside the hall, Belshazzar drank again from the golden cup. He felt powerful, untouchable, the king of the greatest empire on earth. But that confidence would not last much longer. Because the next moment, something impossible was about to appear in the palace of Babylon. Something no king had ever seen before. Something that would stop the music, silence the laughter, and turn the proud ruler of Babylon into a trembling man. The message from heaven was about to be written, and everyone in that hall would see it. The feast in the palace of Babylon had reached its loudest moment. Music thundered through the great hall. Harps, flutes, and drums filled the air while nobles shouted over one another, their voices thick with wine. Servants hurried between the tables carrying more food and pouring more drink. The sacred golden vessels from the temple in Jerusalem were now scattered across the banquet tables. Some were filled with wine. Others had already been knocked over during the reckless celebration. The nobles of Babylon lifted those holy cups again and again, mocking the God whose temple they had once belonged to. At the center of it all stood King Belshazzar. The king laughed loudly as he drank from one of the golden vessels. His crown tilted slightly on his head as he leaned back on his throne, completely lost in the arrogance of the moment. Around him, the nobles shouted praises to their idols. To the gods of Babylon. To the gods of gold and silver. To the gods who made our empire great. Their voices echoed off the tall marble pillars of the banquet hall. Yet beneath the roaring celebration, something began to change. At first, no one noticed. The torches along the palace walls flickered strangely. A small gust of wind moved through the hall, though no doors had opened. A few of the guests glanced around uneasily. But the music continued. The laughter continued. And Belshazzar continued drinking. Then suddenly, the air grew cold. One of the servants stopped walking and stared toward the wall behind the king. His eyes widened. He dropped the tray he was carrying. The sound of metal crashing against the floor echoed across the hall. A few nobles turned their heads in annoyance. But then they saw it too. Something was moving on the wall. At first it looked like a shadow. But shadows do not glow. And shadows do not move with purpose. Slowly, silently, something appeared in the air near the palace wall. It began with fingers. Then a hand. A human hand. But there was no arm attached to it. No body. No visible source. Just a hand suspended in the air as if it belonged to an invisible being. The music faltered. A musician missed a note. Another stopped playing entirely. Voices began to fade as people noticed what was happening. The floating hand moved slowly toward the plaster wall of the palace. And then, it began to write. The finger pressed against the wall. A scratching sound echoed through the silent hall. Letter by letter, glowing marks appeared on the plaster. Strange symbols. Ancient characters. The light from the writing shimmered against the wall, brighter than the torchlight around it. One noble gasped. Another dropped his cup. The entire hall began to fall into stunned silence. The musicians stopped playing. Servants froze in place. Every eye in the room turned toward the wall. The mysterious hand continued writing. Deliberate. Steady. Unhurried. Each letter appeared with glowing brightness. The sound of the finger scraping across the plaster seemed impossibly loud now that the music had stopped. At the center of the hall, Belshazzar finally noticed the silence. He He turned his head toward the wall, and the moment he saw the hand, everything inside him changed. The proud smile vanished from his face. His eyes widened in terror. The color drained from his skin. The cup in his hand trembled violently before slipping from his fingers and crashing onto the stone floor. The mighty king of Babylon, ruler of a vast empire, was suddenly shaking with fear. The ancient record says that his face turned pale and his knees knocked together. Belshazzar could not look away. No one could. The glowing message continued to appear on the wall as the invisible hand finished its work. Finally, the last letter was written. The hand paused for a moment. Then it disappeared, just as suddenly as it had appeared. Gone. The hall remained frozen in silence. Thousands of people stared at the wall, their eyes fixed on the glowing words that now covered the plaster. For mysterious words burned against the surface. Emieni, Emieni, Tekel, Parson. No one spoke. No one moved. The only sound in the enormous hall was the crackling of the torches. Belshazzar stared at the message, his heart pounding in his chest. He had faced enemies before. He had commanded armies. He had ruled over nations. But this was something entirely different. This was not the work of any human hand. Something supernatural had entered his palace. Something far beyond the power of kings. The nobles began whispering nervously. What does it mean? Who wrote it? Is it a warning? Some of the guests backed away from the wall as if the glowing letters might suddenly move again. Others stared at the message in confusion. The words were clear, but their meaning was hidden. At last Belshazzar found his voice. His command echoed through the hall, though his voice trembled as he spoke. Bring the wise men, he shouted. Bring the enchanters. Bring the astrologers. His voice grew louder as panic spread through the room. Whoever can read this writing and tell me what it means will be rewarded. Servants ran from the hall to summon the king's advisors. Belshazzar tried to steady himself. He stood from his throne and pointed toward the wall. Whoever explains this message, he declared, will be clothed in purple, given a chain of gold, and made the third ruler in the kingdom. It was an enormous reward, the highest honor Belshazzar could offer. But even as the words left his mouth, the king felt a growing dread inside his heart. Because deep down, he already knew. This message had not come from any human messenger, and whatever it meant, it could not be ignored. The great banquet hall of Babylon no longer sounded like a celebration. Only moments earlier, music had filled the palace of King Belshazzar. Laughter had echoed between the tall marble pillars, and nobles had raised their cups in reckless joy. Now the room was heavy with fear. Thousands of eyes stared at the glowing words carved across the plaster wall. Emieni, Emieni, Tekel, Parson. The letters shimmered in the torchlight as if they carried a power that did not belong to this world. The nobles whispered nervously among themselves. Some leaned closer to the wall, trying to understand the message. Others stepped back, unwilling to get too near the mysterious writing. At the center of the hall, Belshazzar stood frozen, his face still pale. The confidence he had displayed earlier was gone. In its place was something far more unsettling. Fear. The king clenched his fists as he stared at the message. He had offered a great reward. Purple robes. A chain of gold. Power in the kingdom. Surely someone in Babylon could explain the meaning. Babylon was famous for its scholars and wise men. For generations, the empire had gathered astrologers, magicians, and interpreters of dreams from across the ancient world. If anyone could solve the mystery, it would be them. A few minutes later, the doors of the banquet hall opened. The king's advisors entered. The magicians came first. Men dressed in dark robes embroidered with symbols and stars. They were known for studying ancient scrolls and hidden knowledge. Behind them came the astrologers. These men watched the skies, believing the movements of stars revealed the secrets of the future. Then came the enchanters and scholars, men trained in languages, riddles, and mysteries from distant lands. One by one they stepped forward. Their faces were serious as they approached the wall. Belshazzar pointed at the glowing message. Read it, he commanded. Tell me what it means. The wise men studied the letters carefully. They whispered to each other. One traced the shapes of the words with his finger in the air. Another shook his head slowly. The symbols were clear, but their meaning was not. Minutes passed. Then more minutes. The hall remained silent except for quiet murmurs between the scholars. Belshazzar's patience began to fade. Well, the king demanded. Speak. One of the astrologers stepped forward nervously. "My lord, we see the writing," he said cautiously, "but we do not understand it." A murmur spread through the hall. Belshazzar's eyes narrowed. "What do you mean you do not understand it?" he snapped. Another scholar tried to explain. "The words are ancient, Your Majesty. Their meaning is unusual. But you are the wisest men in Babylon." Belshazzar shouted. "You read the stars. You interpret dreams. You claim to know the secrets of the gods." The men lowered their eyes. Still none of them could explain the message. The king's breathing grew heavier. His fear was quickly turning into panic. He pointed again at the glowing words. "I will reward you richly." Belshazzar shouted. "Purple robes. A chain of gold. Authority in the kingdom." Still no one spoke. Not a single advisor stepped forward with an answer. The silence stretched across the hall like a shadow. The nobles began whispering again. If the wisest men in Babylon could not interpret the message, then who could? Belshazzar felt his stomach tighten. The mysterious writing still burned against the wall, and the longer he looked at it, the more certain he became that it was not good news. The king's fear grew stronger. His face turned even paler. The Bible records that the king's thoughts troubled him deeply. He began pacing back and forth across the platform, glancing repeatedly at the glowing words. The great ruler of Babylon no longer looked powerful. He looked helpless. Around him, the nobles exchanged worried looks. If the king could not understand the message, what hope did the rest of them have? Just then, another voice entered the hall. A calm voice. An older voice. It came from the entrance of the banquet chamber. The king should not be troubled. Everyone turned toward the doorway. Standing there was the queen. Most scholars believe this woman was likely the queen mother, someone who had lived long enough to remember the reign of Nebuchadnezzar. Unlike the drunken nobles in the hall, she had not been part of the feast. But the strange events had reached her ears, and she knew something the younger generation had forgotten. She stepped forward slowly, her voice steady as she addressed the king. "O king, live forever," she said respectfully. "Do not let your thoughts trouble you, and do not let your face grow pale." Belshazzar looked at her impatiently. "If you know the meaning of the writing, then speak," he said. The queen shook her head. "I cannot interpret it," she replied. "But there is a man in your kingdom who can." The nobles leaned closer. Belshazzar frowned. "A man?" he asked. "Yes," the queen continued. "In the days of your father, of Nebuchadnezzar, this man was known for wisdom beyond all others." She paused before speaking the name. "A man called Daniel." Some of the older nobles nodded slowly. They remembered him. Years earlier, Daniel had interpreted dreams no one else could understand. He had explained visions that had baffled the greatest scholars in Babylon. The queen continued. "In him is the spirit of wisdom, understanding, and insight," she said. "Your father made him chief of the magicians, astrologers, and wise men." Belshazzar listened carefully. He had heard the name Daniel before, but he had never truly paid attention to the old prophet. Now, however, he had no other choice. "Send for him," the queen said. "Let Daniel be brought before the king." The hall fell silent again. Servants hurried out of the palace to find the elderly prophet. And somewhere in the city of Babylon, Daniel was about to receive an unexpected summons. A summons that would lead him into the palace one last time, to stand before a frightened king, and reveal the terrifying meaning of the message written by heaven itself. The great palace of Babylon remained frozen in tension. The feast that had begun with laughter and arrogance had turned into a hall filled with whispers and fear. The nobles who had once shouted praises to their idols now sat quietly, glancing again and again toward the glowing message on the wall. Emieni, Emieni, Tekel, Parson. The mysterious words still shone against the plaster, bright and impossible to ignore. At the center of the hall, King Belshazzar paced nervously across the floor. His advisors had failed him. The magicians could not read the message. The astrologers could not explain it. The scholars who claimed to understand ancient mysteries stood helpless before the wall. And now the king waited. Somewhere in the city, servants had been sent to find the one man the queen had mentioned. An old man. A man many in the younger generation barely remembered, but a man whose wisdom had once astonished kings. His name was Daniel. For decades Daniel had lived in Babylon. He had arrived there as a young exile when the armies of Nebuchadnezzar captured the city of Jerusalem. In those early years Daniel had served faithfully in the royal court. He had interpreted impossible dreams. He had revealed hidden mysteries, and his wisdom had earned him great respect under Nebuchadnezzar's rule. But time changes many things. Kings rise, kings fall, and new rulers often forget the lessons of the past. Belshazzar had not relied on Daniel the way earlier kings had. The young king preferred the company of flatterers, men who praised his greatness rather than challenged his pride. So Daniel had quietly faded from the center of royal life. Years passed. The empire changed, but Daniel remained in Babylon, watching, waiting, and trusting the God he served. Now, suddenly, his wisdom was needed again. The palace doors opened. A group of royal guards entered the hall. Between them walked the elderly prophet. Daniel's hair was now white with age, but his posture remained steady. His eyes were calm, filled with the quiet confidence of someone who had walked with God for many years. The nobles whispered among themselves as he approached. Some recognized him immediately. Others had only heard stories. Stories about a man who could reveal secrets no one else could understand. Daniel stepped forward until he stood before the throne of Belshazzar. The king studied him carefully. This old man did not look like the powerful advisors who usually filled the royal court. He wore no jeweled robes. He carried no symbols of rank. But there was something different about him. A quiet authority. A calmness that did not match the fear filling the room. Belshazzar spoke first. "Are you Daniel?" the king asked. "The one who was brought from Judah by my predecessor, Nebuchadnezzar?" Daniel nodded respectfully. "I have heard about you," Belshazzar continued. "They say that the spirit of the gods is in you. They say you have insight and understanding beyond ordinary men." The king gestured toward the glowing message on the wall. "My wise men cannot read this writing or explain its meaning." He stepped closer to Daniel. "But if you can read it and tell me what it means, you will be rewarded." Belshazzar raised his hand dramatically. "You will be clothed in purple. A chain of gold will be placed around your neck, and you will become the third highest ruler in the kingdom." The entire hall waited for Daniel's response. Such an offer would have tempted almost anyone. Power, honor, wealth. But Daniel did not seem impressed. The old prophet looked at the king quietly for a moment. Then he spoke. "Your Majesty may keep your gifts," Daniel said calmly, "and give your rewards to someone else." A ripple of surprise spread through the room. No one spoke to the king that way. Yet Daniel's voice held no fear, no arrogance, only truth. "Nevertheless," Daniel continued, "I will read the writing for the king and tell him what it means." Belshazzar nodded, relieved. But Daniel did not immediately turn to the wall. Instead, he began speaking about the past. "Your Majesty," Daniel said, "the Most High God gave your predecessor Nebuchadnezzar sovereignty, greatness, glory, and splendor." The nobles listened carefully. Daniel continued, "Because of the high position God gave him, people of all nations and languages feared and trembled before him. He had power over life and death. He could promote anyone he wished, or humble anyone he wished." Belshazzar shifted uncomfortably. He knew the stories of Nebuchadnezzar, but Daniel had not finished. But when his heart became arrogant, Daniel said, and he was filled with pride, he was removed from his royal throne. The hall grew quieter. His glory was taken away, Daniel continued. He was driven away from people. He lived like an animal. He ate grass like cattle. His body was drenched with the dew of heaven. Some nobles glanced nervously at Belshazzar. Daniel's words were not flattering, but the prophet spoke without hesitation. "All this happened," Daniel said, "until he acknowledged that the Most High God rules over all kingdoms on earth." Daniel finally turned his gaze directly toward the king. "But you, Belshazzar." The room grew silent. "You knew all this," Daniel said, "and yet you have not humbled yourself." Belshazzar felt the weight of those words. Daniel pointed toward the banquet tables. "You have set yourself against the Lord of heaven. You brought the vessels from his temple. You and your nobles drank wine from them. You praised gods made of silver and gold, bronze, iron, wood, and stone. Gods that cannot see, cannot hear, and cannot understand." Daniel's voice became stronger. "But you did not honor the God who holds your life in his hand." The hall felt colder. Every noble stared at Daniel now. Even the king could not interrupt. Daniel raised his hand toward the wall. That is why the hand was sent. That is why the message was written. The glowing words seemed brighter now as everyone looked toward them. Belshazzar swallowed nervously. For For the first time that night, someone was about to explain the message from heaven, and the meaning would be far more terrifying than anyone expected. The Great Hall of Babylon had never been so silent. Moments earlier, music and drunken laughter had filled the palace of King Belshazzar. The nobles had mocked heaven while drinking from the sacred vessels taken from the temple in Jerusalem. Now the celebration felt like a distant memory. Thousands of eyes stared at the glowing message carved across the wall. Emieni, Emieni, Tekel, Parson. The letters burned with an unnatural brightness, as if they carried authority beyond this world. Standing before the king, Daniel slowly lifted his eyes toward the writing. The elderly prophet had already spoken boldly to the king, reminding him of the lessons from the life of Nebuchadnezzar, a ruler who had once learned the hard way that heaven rules over every kingdom on earth. But Belshazzar had ignored that lesson. He had mocked the God of heaven, and now the message had come. Daniel stepped closer to the wall. The torches flickered around him as he studied the glowing words. Then he turned back toward the king. "This is the writing that was inscribed," Daniel said. He raised his hand toward the wall and read the message aloud. Emieni, Emieni, Tekel, Parson. His voice echoed through the silent chamber. The nobles leaned forward anxiously. Even the king held his breath. Daniel began explaining the meaning. He said. The word means numbered. Daniel's voice carried authority as he continued. God has numbered the days of your kingdom and brought them to an end. A wave of shock moved through the hall. Belshazzar stared at him. An end? The mighty empire of Babylon. Brought to an end? It sounded impossible. Babylon was the greatest city in the ancient world. Its walls were massive. Its gates were strong. Its armies were powerful. Surely no enemy could destroy it overnight. Yet Daniel did not hesitate. He moved to the next word. Tekel, he said. The word means weighed. The prophet looked directly at the king. You have been weighed on the scales and found wanting. A murmur spread through the nobles. The meaning was becoming clearer now. This was not a blessing. It was a judgment. Daniel continued. The God of heaven has examined your life, your rule, and your heart, and you have been found lacking. Belshazzar's face tightened. He did not like hearing these words, but he could not stop the prophet. Daniel lifted his hand toward the final word. Parson. The word means divided. The hall seemed to grow colder. Your kingdom, Daniel declared, will be divided and given to the Medes and Persians. Gasps spread across the room. The Medes and Persians? They were enemies of Babylon, but they were far away, or so everyone believed. Yet Daniel's voice carried absolute certainty. God has spoken, he said. The days of Babylon are finished. The meaning of the message was now clear. Numbered. Weighed. Divided. It was a divine verdict. A heavenly judgment. The king of Babylon had mocked God, and now God had answered. Belshazzar stood frozen. His mind raced as he tried to process what Daniel had said. The idea seemed impossible. Babylon falling in a single night? No empire in history had ever conquered its walls so quickly. But something inside him felt uneasy. Because deep down, he knew the message was real. No human hand had written those words. The message had come from heaven itself. For a moment, the entire hall remained silent. Then Belshazzar straightened his robe and forced himself to act like a king again. He could not show weakness before his nobles. He turned to his servants. Carry out the reward, he ordered. Despite the terrifying prophecy, the king kept his promise. Daniel was clothed in royal purple. A chain of gold was placed around his neck, and the decree was announced that he would become the third ruler in the kingdom. The nobles obeyed the king's command, though many of them looked uneasy. The prophecy still hung in the air. Babylon would fall. The empire would be divided. But Belshazzar tried to ignore the fear growing inside him. Perhaps the prophecy would take years. Perhaps it would happen after his lifetime. Perhaps the wise man had misunderstood. After all, the city of Babylon still stood strong. Its massive walls surrounded the capital like an unbreakable fortress. Historians say those walls were so wide that chariots could race along the top. No enemy had ever broken through them. And outside those walls flowed the great Euphrates River, a natural barrier protecting the city. Babylon looked invincible. Yet while the king celebrated inside the palace, something was already happening outside the city. An army had surrounded Babylon. The soldiers of the Medes and Persians had been waiting patiently. They knew they could not easily break through Babylon's mighty walls. So they used a different strategy. Instead of attacking the walls, they changed the river. Upstream, engineers dug canals and redirected the flow of the Euphrates. Slowly, quietly, the water level began to fall. The river that flowed through the center of Babylon started to drop lower and lower. The guards at the gates barely noticed. Inside the city, the people were celebrating. Music echoed through the streets. The king's feast had inspired parties across the capital. Many soldiers had abandoned their posts. Many gates along the river were left unguarded. And as the water dropped low enough for soldiers to walk through the riverbed, the enemy began to move. Thousands of Persian soldiers quietly marched along the dry river channel beneath the walls. No alarms sounded. No trumpets warned the city. The army slipped into Babylon like a shadow. And inside the palace, the king still sat beneath the glowing message written by heaven. A message that had already begun to come true. Dawn slowly rose over the once mighty city of Babylon. For centuries, Babylon had stood as one of the greatest cities on earth. Its towering walls, magnificent palaces, and legendary wealth had made it the pride of the ancient world. Travelers from distant lands had come to marvel at its greatness. But on this morning, everything had changed. The streets that had been filled with music and celebration only hours earlier now echoed with the sounds of marching soldiers. The banners that once carried the symbols of Babylon had been lowered. In their place now flew the standards of a new empire, the empire of the Medes and Persians. The fall of Babylon had happened so quickly that many of its citizens could barely believe it. Only the night before, the palace of King Belshazzar had hosted one of the most extravagant feasts in the empire's history. Thousands of nobles had gathered to celebrate the greatness of Babylon and the supposed power of their gods. Yet before the sun had risen again, the king was dead. The palace had been captured, and the empire had fallen. The prophecies spoken by Daniel had come true with astonishing precision. God has numbered the days of your kingdom and brought it to an end. You have been weighed on the scales and found wanting. Your kingdom will be divided and given to the Medes and Persians. Every word had been fulfilled. Inside the royal palace, Persian soldiers now stood guard at every entrance. The once powerful Babylonian nobles had either fled, surrendered, or been captured. The great throne of Babylon no longer belonged to Belshazzar. Instead, authority now passed to a new ruler, a man the Bible calls Darius the Mede. Darius was not the conqueror himself. That honor belonged to the powerful Persian leader Cyrus the Great. But Cyrus placed Darius in charge of Babylon, making him the ruler over the newly conquered kingdom. For the people of Babylon, the change was shocking. One day they lived under the rule of their own king. The next day they woke up under the authority of a completely different empire. History had turned overnight. And yet, for one man in the city, the events of that night were not surprising. Daniel, the elderly prophet, had watched the rise and fall of kings for decades. He had served under the reign of Nebuchadnezzar, the powerful ruler who first conquered Jerusalem and brought many Jewish exiles to Babylon. Daniel had witnessed Nebuchadnezzar's pride. He had seen the king humbled by God. He had watched the empire grow in power. And now, he had witnessed its fall. But Daniel understood something that many rulers never learned. Earthly kingdoms do not last forever. No matter how powerful they appear, no matter how strong their armies are, no matter how high their walls rise, every kingdom built by human hands eventually fades. Only the kingdom of God endures forever. As the new Persian administration began organizing the city, Daniel remained a respected figure among the officials. His reputation for wisdom had already spread throughout Babylon long before the Persians arrived, and the events of the previous night had only strengthened that reputation. After all, Daniel had interpreted the mysterious message before the fall of the city. He had announced the judgment before it happened. Now the entire empire could see that his words had been true. Because of this, Daniel soon found favor under the new leadership as well. The Bible records that Darius the Mede respected Daniel greatly. The prophet's wisdom, honesty, and faithfulness made him stand out among the officials of the new kingdom. Even though Daniel was now an old man, his story was not finished. In fact, the next chapter of his life would lead to one of the most famous miracles in the entire Bible, a miracle involving lions. But that story would come later. For now, the focus remained on the incredible events that had just taken place. The fall of Babylon was not just a political event. It was a reminder. a powerful reminder that pride and arrogance cannot stand forever. Belshazzar had mocked the God of heaven. He had taken the sacred vessels from the temple in Jerusalem and used them during a drunken feast. He had praised lifeless idols made of gold, silver, and stone. And when the warning from heaven appeared on the wall, he did not truly repent. Instead, he tried to reward the messenger and ignore the message. But the judgment of God could not be ignored. That very night, the empire fell, and the words written by the mysterious hand became one of the most unforgettable warnings in history. Emyeni, Tekel, Parson, a message that reminds every generation of a simple truth. Power can disappear in a moment. Kingdoms can fall overnight. But the authority of God remains unshaken. The city of Babylon would continue to exist for many years after that night, but it would never again hold the same power it once had. The golden age of Babylon had ended. A new empire had begun, and history moved forward under the rule of the Medes and Persians. Yet long after the walls of Babylon crumbled, long after its palaces turned to dust, the story of the mysterious writing on the wall continued to be told. A story about pride, a story about warning, and a story about the moment when heaven spoke directly into human history. A glowing message written by a hand no one could see, but a message the world would never forget. Long after the night of terror had passed, the story of what happened in Babylon continued to spread across nations and generations. People spoke about the mysterious hand. They spoke about the glowing message on the wall. They spoke about the king whose pride had blinded him, and the prophet who understood the warning from heaven. But the most powerful part of the story was not the fall of a city. It was the lesson behind it. Babylon had once seemed unstoppable. Its walls were enormous, its wealth unmatched. Its rulers believed their empire would last forever. Kings like Nebuchadnezzar had ruled with unmatched authority. Nations trembled before the power of Babylon. Armies marched at the command of its kings. Yet even the greatest empire in the world could not escape a simple truth. Power does not belong to human rulers forever. The rise and fall of kingdoms ultimately rests in the hands of God. That was the lesson Daniel had learned throughout his long life. As a young man, Daniel had been taken captive when Babylon conquered Jerusalem. He was brought to a foreign land, forced to live among people who worshiped different gods and followed different traditions. But Daniel never forgot the God he served. Even when surrounded by power and wealth, he remained faithful. He trusted that God was still in control, even when the world seemed chaotic. And over the years, God continued to reveal his power through Daniel's life. Daniel had interpreted dreams that no one else could understand. He had spoken truth to kings who ruled over vast empires. He had watched rulers rise to glory and fall into humiliation. Now, in his old age, he witnessed yet another reminder that human power is temporary. The feast of King Belshazzar had seemed like a moment of celebration and triumph. The king believed he was secure. He believed Babylon was untouchable. But that very night, a message from heaven revealed the truth. Emyeni, God had numbered the days of the kingdom. Tekel, the king had been weighed and found lacking. Parson, the kingdom would be divided and given to the Medes and Persians. And before the night ended, every word of that message became reality. The empire fell. The king died. A new ruler took the throne. The powerful city of Babylon had learned a lesson that echoes through history. Pride can blind even the strongest rulers. Arrogance can cause people to ignore warnings until it is too late. And mocking the things of God carries consequences. Yet the story is not only about judgment. It is also about faithfulness. Because in the middle of that proud and powerful empire stood one man who refused to compromise. Daniel. While kings chased power and glory, Daniel quietly remained faithful to God. While others bowed to idols, Daniel continued to honor the God of heaven. While rulers changed and empires shifted, Daniel's trust in God never wavered. That faithfulness became a light in a dark place. And even the kings of powerful nations eventually recognized that something about Daniel was different. The Bible describes it as an excellent spirit, a wisdom that did not come from human learning alone, a courage that did not come from earthly power, a confidence rooted in the knowledge that God rules over history. And that truth still matters today. The story of the writing on the wall reminds us that success, wealth, and power can never replace humility before God. It reminds us that every life is ultimately weighed on a scale far greater than human standards. Not the scale of fame, not the scale of influence, but the scale of character, integrity, faith. Belshazzar had everything the world could offer, but when his life was weighed, it was found lacking. Daniel, on the other hand, possessed something far more valuable, a life rooted in faithfulness, a life aligned with God's truth. And that is why his story continues to inspire people thousands of years later. Because while empires rise and fall, while cities grow and disappear, the lessons of that mysterious message still speak today. Every generation faces the same choice: to chase pride and power like Belshazzar, or to live faithfully like Daniel. One path leads to downfall, the other leads to a legacy that outlives kingdoms. And so the ancient words written on a palace wall in Babylon continue to echo across history. Emieni, Tekel, Parson, a message written in light, a warning written in truth, and a reminder that above every throne, above every empire, above every king, the God of heaven still rules, forever.